I'm Mira Wasserman, the director of the Center for Jewish Ethics at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and in a moment, I'll have the pleasure of introducing today's lecturer. First, I want to share a few brief words of introduction for those who are joining us for the first time. I also want to follow up on last week's lecture. For those of you who are here with us for the first time, this lecture series on Jews, race, and religion comes from a partnership between the Center for Jewish Ethics and the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. We are grateful for a grant from the Campaign for Community from Penn's Office of the Provost and for support from the SNF Paideia program at Penn. I thank all the staff at the Katz Center for all their work on this series. Following today's lecture, you will meet Professor Steve Weitzman, director of the Katz Center, and Dr. Ann Albert, the Katz Center's director of public programs, who will together moderate the Q&A. Now, if you were with us last time, you might remember that we did not have time for Q&A. Last week's lecturer, Dr. J. Cameron Carter, had announced his intention to instigate conversation, and his remarks indeed provoked a wide range of responses during the lecture and afterwards. We have been able to share some of your incisive questions and challenges with Professor Carter, and we look forward to being able to post his responses on the website that accompanies this lecture series soon. We will also be sharing a response to his presentation from a Jewish Studies professor, and we'll let you know when that material is available as well. During the past week, many people reached out expressing an interest in pursuing more dialogue and discussion and in delving deeper into the ideas that this series is raising. We also learned that in some congregations, groups are meeting to discuss these lectures. This is all very exciting. Unfortunately, we cannot organize discussion groups ourselves, but this is what we can do to support those of you who want to get together with friends or colleagues for discussion and reflection. With the help of Rabbi Micah Weiss from the Thriving Communities Department at Reconstructing Judaism, we have gathered suggestions for how to convene your own discussion group. A link to these guidelines is going to be posted, there it is, in the chat. Also, each week following the lectures, we will be posting some suggested discussion questions for you to consider. And in the chat, you'll find a link to the website where the discussion questions and some other resources can be found. And I want to thank Rabbinic intern Armin Langer for all of his work in bringing these resources together on the website. To today's program. Last week, we began exploring religion and whiteness, a theme to which we will return today, even as we approach it from a different direction. Our lecturer today is Professor Sophie Bjork-James from the Anthropology Department at Vanderbilt University. Professor Bjork-James researches both the US-based religious right and white nationalist movements. She's the author of the new book, The Divine Institution, White Evangelicalism's Politics of the Family, and the co-editor of the recent Beyond Populism, Angry Politics in the Twilight of Neoliberalism. Her work has appeared in leading scholarly journals and in the popular media, where she has shared her expertise on NBC Nightly News, NPR's All Things Considered, BBC Radio 4's Today, and in the New York Times. In recent weeks, she has been a go-to expert in explaining the potent mix of racial and religious thinking that was on display in the January 6th riot at the Capitol. I am delighted that she is able to share her research and insights with us today. Her lecture is entitled Religion and White Supremacy in the United States. Welcome, Professor Bjork-James.
Thank you so much, and I'm thrilled to be here and to be participating in this conversation. So let me share my slides. So, good afternoon from a snowy Nashville. I'm beginning today with a painting that can be found in the US Capitol Rotunda, and I find it ironic to be sharing this image in this conversation today because of the attention that the Capitol has received in of late because of the insurrection that happened on January 6th. And I think I will hopefully be able to talk more about that in the Q&A. But I'm beginning with this painting because I think it demonstrates so clearly the history of the ways that religion and race, and particularly white supremacy, have been entwined throughout US history. So this painting was commissioned in 1839. It still hangs in the Capitol Rotunda. It depicts the official description of the painting says, "This painting depicts the ceremony in which Pocahontas, daughter of the influential Algonquin chief Powhatan, was baptized and given the name Rebecca in an Anglican church. It took place in 1613 or 1614 in the colony at Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement on the North American continent. Pocahontas is thought to be the earliest native convert to Christianity in the English colonies. This ceremony and her subsequent marriage to John Rolfe helped to establish peaceful relations between the colonists and the Tidewater tribes." I argue that this painting represents an origin story for the US nation, one uniting Christianity, colonization, and white supremacy. I begin with this painting because it shows the ways religion and race are entwined in our national narratives in both official and unofficial ways. I'll return to this painting later on in my talk to show how contemporary religious movements can mobilize these historical narratives to justify racial politics in the present. So this painting in particular demonstrates another key way that racial politics have united with religious politics in the United States, and that is through the institution of marriage and normative sexuality. For, as in the official description, it is Pocahontas' conversion and marriage to John Rolfe that causes this painting to be deemed worthy to remain in the Capitol today. So my talk today is going to explore the history and contemporary relationship between religion and white supremacy in the United States. I'm going to begin with definitions. We don't always mean the same thing when we talk about race, racism, and white supremacy, so I'm going to be clear at the beginning with the definitions that I am using. I'll then move into a general discussion of how white supremacy and religion have intersected in the United States before moving on to a case study based on my own long-term research among white evangelicals in Colorado Springs. And then I will conclude with a discussion of some of the obvious and non-obvious reasons why this conversation is so crucial to have today. Let me begin with definitions. So I'm proposing that we can think about 4 different manifestations of racism. The individual racism is how we typically understand, like it's kind of a common sense, commonly accepted understanding about racism, right? This is where about personal prejudice that an individual can have, right? And it's often now framed as a character flaw in like kind of mainstream US society. We can also think about implicit bias, and these are biases that exist below the level of our own awareness, so that even someone may believe themselves to not be prejudiced against a group of people, a religion, a gender, sexual orientation, but they may have internalized bias that then shapes how they interact with people and like decisions that they make. We can also think about white nationalism, the white power movement, or organized racism. And this is a social movement working for political power. So these are people who are, many of them will not describe themselves as white supremacists, but what they are focused on is shoring up white supremacy and defending white privilege, right? But that's a social movement. And then the other layer of racism that I'm going to mainly be focusing on today is institutional racism or white supremacy. And this is a system that unevenly divides up social, economic, and environmental goods based on racial classification. So I'm going to list them all here so that we can see how they interrelate, because these are all very much interconnected. We have implicit bias largely because we've internalized from the social structures that we live in the biases that are in that system. There's also an important relationship between institutionalized racism and white nationalism, in that throughout US history, every attempt to expand the promise of multiracial democracy, so every attempt to disband some element of white supremacy, has been met with organized white resistance. So we can see that with the abolition of the institution of slavery in the United States and the creation of the Ku Klux Klan, a white terrorist organization that helped to then use racial terror to reinforce white supremacy. And throughout the history of the United States, every attempt to expand the promise of multiracial democracy has inspired organized resistance. So I think these are important to recognize how interrelated they are. So for institutionalized white supremacy, has three pillars. And I get this definition from the Western State Center, an important NGO out of Portland, Oregon, working to support democracy. But there's the three pillars of this are anti-Black racism, genocide of Native peoples, and control of women's bodies and sexuality. And I think it's very important to include this conversation about gender and sexuality, which I'm going to go into in some detail, because we often think about gender and sexual politics as separate from racial politics. But I think if we look very closely, we can see that they're very much entwined and have been historically. So white supremacy as a system ensures the privileging of those deemed white. Now, as a social scientist, I also understand that if we look at any measure of racial inequality, any indicator of racial inequality, it is clear that we have not yet achieved equality. Whether we are looking at everything from life expectancy to income to wealth, to the likelihood that someone will get a raise or be born prematurely, from whether one is likely to live near a garbage dump or a park or a green space, all of these factors are shaped, not determined, but shaped by race. So we can see on virtually every social indicator we could look at that racial inequality is still shaping the map of the United States. It is still shaping life chances and possibilities. So within a society like the United States, which was founded on and organized by institutionalized white supremacy, there is no religion is race neutral. So we need to ask how religious beliefs, practices, and structures of authority interact with the reality of white supremacy. I'm inspired by Ibram Kendi's work, How to Be an Anti-Racist, that asks us all to see ourselves not as able to stand out from questions of racism. And that it's saying it's not enough just to be non-racist, that we have to actively seek to be anti-racist to challenge these systems of inequality. And this applies to religions as well. This interrogation raises important ethical questions, both about harm and ignorance, particularly regarding what my colleague Rachel Schneider and I refer to as white religion. These are white-dominated religions that have tended to obscure the reality of racial inequality. So my research, both in the US-based religious right and white nationalist movements, I've studied the online white nationalist movement for over a decade and the white evangelical culture in Colorado Springs, also for over a decade. And from that research, it became very clear that what I refer to as the language of race is gender. I think this is obvious when we can think about there's so many examples, but stereotypes vilifying Blackness is expressed in rampant sexual lust in opposition to a sexually controlled whiteness have dominated centuries of racial justification, as the scholar Winthrop Jordan shows in his History of US Racial Norms, White Over Black. In the 18th century, marriage and family law worked to construct the idea of separate and unequal races with the outlawing of interracial unions, defining some children as kin and others as property. Race historically was expressed through gender and familial ideals. So in the South, the primary racist organization, the Ku Klux Klan, understood the defense of patriarchy as a defense of whiteness. Black and white women who challenged the social norms of the community were often the targets of Klan harassment and violence. Religious studies scholar R. Marie Griffith writes of the historical hegemonic status of a particular family form in the United States, one that helped to shore up these respectability politics. Quote, up through the end of the 19th century, whatever else Americans disagreed about, most accepted and took for granted as natural a sexual order in which men were heads of households, wives were to submit to husbands, and monogamous heterosexual marriage was the only sanctioned site for sexual relations. That this normative, kind of dominant normative sexual politics, as Patricia Hill Collins' work shows, also shaped stereotypes about Black sexual politics, which have remained a central justification for racism. Sexual and familial norms were articulated as racial in the colonial Americas as European settlers found Native American sexual and familial practices troubling, as First Nations cultures tended to see marriage as a choice, not a lifelong commitment, and childbearing was collective. In contrast, European settlers understood the patriarchal family as a Christian moral good, one connected to private property. Historian Estelle Freeman writes, these beliefs in the superiority of the white European family and sexual practices provided a justification for the appropriation of land and the cultural devaluation of conquered peoples. US governmental policy often focused on attempts at implementing the patriarchal family structure onto traditional Native American cultural systems. So, for example, the Dawes Act of 1887 attempted to force Native peoples to adopt the patriarchal family through privatizing land and forcing patrilineal inheritance. I argue that contemporary sexual politics should not be understood as separate from this history, where norms around sexuality and gender represented whiteness as pure, moral, and good, and vilified Black and Indigenous peoples as inferior, largely through sexual stereotypes and stereotypes about different family forms. In other words, what I call white sexual politics has served to shore up white supremacy, to justify racial inequality and white privilege, and often to obscure this process through a justification that frames its interests as religious and not racial. So religion in the United States always existed in relationship to this broader structure of white supremacy. The combination of worldview produced and practiced and obligations encouraged can either obscure, reinforce, or challenge this broader structure, often in unintentional ways. So although often our disciplinary training allows us to think about race and religion as separate categories, as aspects of social life that can be understood as distinct, this historical record, particularly in the United States, indicates otherwise. So Winthrop Jordan's history shows that before the Civil War, European Americans used Christian, free, English, and white interchangeably. Culturally, race and religion were entwined to the extent that, as Edward Bloom's historical work shows, during the 19th century, almost every aspect of American Protestantism was permeated by whiteness. So even when not explicitly addressing questions of race and racism, white Protestantism deflected attention away from racial inequality by focusing on individual salvation over social gospel issues of justice. So this is very clear in the theologian Dwight Moody in The Great Awakening, that white Protestantism, what it historically and today, often frames salvation, but also social obligations as an individual responsibility and act, and obscures the more collective phenomena and obligations. It also tends to obscure the reality of white supremacy and the structure of white supremacy. So to understand the links between race and Christian traditions, it is useful to turn towards scholars of African American Christianities who have shown how racial histories shape unique biblical interpretations with distinct political effects. So the story of Exodus is a well-researched example. Exodus narratives have been racially inflected to provide both justification for racial inequality and to nurture anti-racist politics. So since the colonial era, white Christian nationalism has fostered the narrative of the United States as a divinely inspired project, linking the colonial project of European American expansion in the Americas to the Exodus narrative worked to sanitize the violence of conquest, genocide, and enslavement by framing America as a promised land and a gift from God, thus framing racial terror as divine inspiration. Historian Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham shows how the Great Awakening and the city on a hill discourse that has dominated US public culture made the Exodus narrative the property of whites. As Albert Rabateau and others have argued, African American Christianity offered a contrasting reading of Exodus, one rooted in experiences of racism and one that can fuel resistance to white supremacy. African American Christians appropriated the Exodus narrative to assert their own equal humanity with whites and to create a shared historical narrative distinct from the dominant colonial one. So this ritualized reading of Exodus as nation constituting has shaped African American political thought in a variety of ways. So my forthcoming book, The Divine Institution, makes a similar argument about the role of race in shaping a specific religious tradition, along with an attendant politics. So while numerous biblical passages can be quoted which celebrate mothers and fathers, families and children, yet like Exodus, these passages are emphasized and interpreted differently based on particular traditions. And just as African American readings of Exodus have imagined the public sphere in relation to racial histories and imaginaries, an emphasis on the family within white evangelicalism shapes not only ideas about proper gender and familial roles in the home, but also constitutes an understanding of a broader public sphere. Emphasizing the normative family as the focal point of religious life proposes a view of the social rooted in hierarchy within relations of submission and authority. This in turn authorizes a variety of other forms of hierarchy. This emphasis also roots social problems and their solutions in personal relationships. So the evangelical focus on the family that I observed in over 16 months of research in evangelical churches in Colorado Springs and at national religious right conferences follows a long tradition of seeing in sexual activity the strength or the demise of the nation. From parachurch political organizations to pastors, sexual activity is linked to the nation in evangelical discourse, uniting religious and national concerns. Interpreting the United States through Exodus as a place of bondage makes racism visible in the national narrative and frames it as a problem that should be addressed. In contrast, the emphasis on the family that structures contemporary white evangelicalism offers a purportedly colorblind understanding of society that renders structural racism invisible. It most often offers the nuclear family as a solution to social problems. It also works to enforce elements that define privilege, unstated norms, invisibility, fragility, including claims to universality. Claiming that this understanding of the family is a mandate from God and a model for government makes other interpretations and other positions appear as incorrect or even as opposing God. So to show how this Christian worldview connects ideas about the family and sexuality to a Christian nationalist perspective, I'll explore an example from the organization Focus on the Family. So in 2006, Focus on the Family, which is one of the most significant white evangelical organizations located in Colorado Springs, but having an international reach. So in 2006, the organization published a 12-week Bible study with a DVD series called The Truth Project. So at one point, Focus on the Family produced dozens of books, magazines, a radio program that is listened to by 240 million people daily around the world. Its political arm has participated in every national anti-gay rights fight for decades. They also direct many resources to helping Christians live out what they call a biblical worldview, and the Truth Project was focused on this goal. The 12-week Bible study consists of a weekly lecture in a formal classroom. The organization estimates that roughly 3 million people have completed the Bible study program. So during week 7, sociology, the divine imprint, the leader of the discussion begins with discussing what he calls the triune nature of God. So he draws a circle on the board and writes Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and says they are in perfect harmony and relationship with each other. He transitions to discussing one of God's sacred institutions, that of the family. He asks the class, because there's a classroom of students in the DVD. So he asks the class, what are the members of the family? To which the students respond in unison. The husband, so Tackett writes husband on the board. Then the students say the wife. He writes the wife. Then the students say children or kids. So he writes these on the board with a symmetry between the two circles. He then asks, when Jesus was praying to the Father, he said that he and the Father were what? And the students say one. Interesting. So he draws a line around the 3, showing a symmetry between like 2 trinities. He says the wife submits to her husband, the son submits to her father, and kind of interacts with the students saying, okay, now we think of submission as a negative word, but it's really not negative. He says it's glorious. He says that the world has distorted it and made it ugly. He says that instead of inequality in this model, what he sees is perfect, quote, perfect unity, perfect relationships, perfect equality, roles and authority and submission. What an incredible social institution. End quote. So he's describing a series of relationships, of hierarchies, rooted in the Protestant Trinity of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, showing the family is in a similar hierarchy. And what's crucial about that is it makes the hierarchy of the family, of a patriarchal heterosexual family, as a foundational unit for embodying the Trinity. So it makes the patriarchal family sacred. And every week, most weeks in the series, he comes back to the same Trinity and continues to place more and more issues within this framework, including work that employees are supposed to submit to the authority of employers because they have power, just like God has power, husband has power, etc. But in week 11 is dedicated to the American experiment. And in his story, he describes going to the US Capitol and seeing 3 paintings and having it be this kind of transcendent experience for him, where he came to see just how special America was in its relationship with God. So let me just walk you through the 3 paintings. So they are the landing of Columbus, which, he said was like a glorious encounter, because it was, he framed Columbus himself as, with a goal not of conquest and colonizing and getting wealthy, but said his goal was about proselytizing and bringing Christianity to the United States, or to the Americas. So in the lecture, he's moved on from talking about the sacredness of the patriarchal family to the sacredness of the U.S. nation. The second painting he shows is the embarkation of the Pilgrims, when the Pilgrims coming to the Americas. And the final is the baptism of Pocahontas. So it's this interesting turn in that he's seeing these paintings that were commissioned in the 19th century of historical facts that occurred hundreds of years earlier, but seeing them in the present as, he was calling them like a touchstone, as a reminder of that God has always had a focus and like a special place for the Americas. So the story fails to mention either genocide of Native peoples or even the institution of slavery. The leader's guide for the series goes so far as to say, quote, in the late 1800s, America began a long journey away from its founding beliefs and principles. So it was critiquing the rise of Darwinism and the beginning of secularization of US institutions. However, in the context of US race relations, to say the United States began losing moral ground after the abolition of slavery is really confounding, particularly given the evangelical movement of the 19th century largely fought for abolition. Tackett does mention that the narrator does mention slavery in a postscript, saying, "Of course, we'd inherited the rot of slavery, but it was these foundations that helped us to understand that that was an injustice." So this telling of the US story of colonization, genocide, and slavery as one of divine inspiration is part of a white racial tradition, in line with the popular Exodus narrative that frames the American nation as a new Israel. It is important to note how the Truth Project's interpretation of the triune nature of God as a foundational hierarchy that defines familial, gendered, and economic relations is related to this broader racial history of the United States. This linkage shows the ways that a vision of Christian nationalism understands the family as the foundation for a social order that is steeped in hierarchies. So if we look at the role of race and citizenship in the forging of the US Republic, we have to see the early US state as Omi and Winott describe it as a racial dictatorship. The Truth Project's resolute refusal to acknowledge the racial history of the US nation is rooted in and productive of what Charles Mills and Linda Martine Alcove call an epistemology of ignorance. It also shows how clearly the worldview articulated in the series is a decidedly racial one. The sacralization of hierarchies at the heart of this worldview is tied explicitly to a history of whiteness and white supremacy that is squarely in the realm of what Omi and Winott call a racial project. I also think it's important because given how influential focus on the family is in shaping a white evangelical worldview, to show that white evangelicals have remained one of the largest voting blocs, the largest voting bloc in the United States for decades, and continue to represent over a third of Republican voters. And I think we can very clearly trace the theological emphasis on the patriarchal family to this shared political commitments in the public. So to conclude, and hopefully get some time for the Q&A, I'm going to talk about a few reasons why dissecting this relationship between religion and white supremacy is crucial in our present moment. So some of these are really obvious, right? White supremacy continues to be a significant ethical concern. Racism steals lives and livelihoods. It causes suffering. It creates a system of privilege and oppression that fosters often constant racial stress for those who are racialized, and leaves many privileged by its system in a state of ignorance that allows us to misrecognize the social reality that we live within and the ethical obligations that we have to overturn these inequalities. And connected to this is the fact that white religion is often used to deny the reality of ongoing white supremacy. So this is an image of Black Lives Matter protesters in Durango, Colorado in 2020, and counter-protesters bringing their flags to counter-protest against this protest for racial justice. So the US Census Bureau currently projects that somewhere between 2040 and 2042, white Americans will lose their majority status in the United States. Social psychological experiments have shown that exposure to these projected changes leads to increased racial bias for whites, both in explicit and implicit forms. Such fears of what social scientists call status threat, or the fear of losing dominant group status, have been shown as a driving factor in current politics and policy, including opposition to welfare programs. A recent poll done by political scientist Larry Bartels found that he calls it ethnic antagonism, or we could also just say racial bias, is leading many white Republicans to view authoritarianism and violence as acceptable so long as it is done in the defense of the racial status quo. And I am certain that religious logics are completely underscoring this position. Bartel's research was conducted in 2020, but I think it shows very clearly the kind of priming of particularly white conservatives to view authoritarianism and extrajudicial violence as acceptable, as so long as it's in the defense of the racial status quo. So this is part of a broader problem where many whites now understand racism as a zero-sum game, as the Norton and Sommers describe it. Many whites now believe not only that whites now experience more discrimination than people of color, but they also believe that gains in status for people of color will lead to increased indiscrimination for whites. So instead of being able to imagine a kind of new reality where everyone can rise together and there isn't a society based on racial stratification, many whites believe that as people of color gain status, it means whites will lose status and then be subjected to the same forms of discrimination that people of color have historically been discriminated against, which leads to resistance to anti-racist efforts. Religious institutions and leaders can help to challenge these trends, demonstrating the need for supporting racial justice, but they have to become clear that the reality of white supremacy continues to shape the United States. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was extremely helpful and edifying. We are going to be joined in a moment by Dr. Ann Albert, who is our Director of Public Programs, and she will be helping us to field questions as they come in. And I want to remind the audience that you can submit a question through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. But while she's reviewing things, I thought I would ask a question of my own just to get the conversation going. Again, with my thanks. So, it's very illuminating to see how race and religion kind of reinforce and interact with each other, and convincing. But the religion that you were talking about is evangelical Christianity, Protestant Christianity. And I guess it's a complication that a lot of white Americans are not Protestant or evangelical or Catholic or Jewish. And I'm just wondering, I know this goes beyond your own research perhaps, but how do they get sucked into this dynamic if they're not Protestant and they're not part of that belief system? And in fact, in Catholics, there was a lot of anti-Catholic and obviously anti-Jewish discriminations. I'm just wondering, how do they fit in?
Yeah. So thanks. So I think there's a lot of different ways to kind of explore that question. I mean, I think one way is to think about this issue of gender, and that there's a way that many people, kind of the way that sorry, I'm trying to think about the best way to frame it. When we talk about whiteness today, it's like this common sense understanding of who is white and who isn't. But 100 years ago, we would have had a very different understanding about who was white. There was like many groups that today we would just believe to be white that were widely not considered to be white 100 years ago. And the entree into whiteness has often been to assimilate into kind of Protestant norms around gender and the family and marriage, and that these kind of sexual norms have been a way that Jewish groups, Catholic groups have kind of allowed them to assimilate into whiteness. So I think that one way is that but this has never been framed as like a racial assimilation, right? And that so I think that there's benefits to that assimilation, the benefits that come with it. But I also think the dominant narratives, even if they aren't fitting all religions, in the United States, our dominant stories downplay the history of racial inequality and downplay it in the present. So I feel like we're finally entering a period where there's for a variety of reasons, we're being asked, all of us, right, to consider the reality of racism and our response to that and our responsibility to that. And so I think that we're in a moment where there is more of a chance for more groups to enter into like the anti-racism. But I think that for people, especially for people who are deemed white, there is a lot of benefit to remaining ignorant of that reality. And I think that goes across, and I think there's need for more study about how that plays out in different religions, Buddhism, Judaism, etc.
Thank you. Let me turn things over to Dr. Albert now.
Thank you so much. All right, we've got a wonderful stream of questions. I'm going to try to sort of organize and group them a little bit because there are so many. So I'll just start by saying that a number of the questions revolve around different ways in which the material and the history that you've presented connect with Judaism, Jewish culture, Jewish history, right? For obvious reasons. So I want to kind of put a couple of different threads of those questions to you. The first one has to do with anti-Semitism. So the question being, in what way these models of white hegemony and white supremacy have been intertwined with not only with anti-racist, but also with anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish attitudes.
Yeah, thank you. So if we think back to like the models that I showed, right, of like thinking about organized like white supremacy as, having three pillars. So anti-Black racism, like genocide or anti-Indigenous racism, control of women and sexuality. That I think historically anti-Semitism was one of those pillars, right? I mean, there was like the Klan of the Klan of like both the 1880s and the 1920s was a Protestant organization. They were very much against Judaism and Jews. There's examples of Jews who were lynched for not fitting into this broader worldview. And then I think what happens over the 1900s is that there's a kind of assimilation of at least Ashkenazi Jews into whiteness, so that now, Ashkenazi Jews are considered to be white. Clearly, anti-Semitism plays out in many different ways. But what organized racism, like white nationalism, the foundation of that is anti-Semitism. So we think about kind of like the structure of white supremacy. Anti-Semitism may no longer be a pillar of that strategy because so many Jews have assimilated into whiteness. But for organized racism, they very much want to support the structure of white supremacy, but add a fourth pillar, which is anti-Semitism. And so a lot of the heart of white supremacy is, and of the heart of the white supremacist movement is anti-Semitism today. And so, they will try to recruit new members with using like anti-Black racism, in particular anti-immigrant racism, but are very much focused on anti-Semitism.
So following up on that and sort of taking it in a different direction, another set of questions that people have been posting have to do with ways in which some of these same structures or attitudes are recapitulated within the Jewish community and among Jews. And I wonder if you're able to speak to that a little bit. To take just a specific example that one person raised, it's the idea of the interpretation of Exodus, right? So that's something that can be seen across many religions and ethnicities, cultures within the United States. Do you see it playing itself out differently among Jews, or are there Jewish thinkers, leaders who are recapitulating some of that same structure in their own thinking?
Yeah, and that's a really great question that unfortunately is beyond my expertise, but I do think that it can play out in very different ways, right? Especially with Exodus, it's the narrative that can be used to, perpetuate inequality, obscure inequality, and challenge it. And so I think the problem can be when people think it's like the narrative fits like my group and only my group, and doesn't recognize that that there's room for like a more intersectional understanding of the ways that there can be like anti-Semitism alongside anti-Black racism and anti-immigrant racism and anti-Indigenous racism, etc. Which is what I think what I can say about that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's totally fair. And I think, it should be up to listeners who, if they're engaged in Jewish communities, to think about that from their own end. So shifting gears just a little bit, coming back to the initial story, or to the story as you started to tell it from the beginning of your talk, one person asked at the very beginning, if Toby asked, if scholars acknowledge that painting about the conversion of Pocahontas is symbolic of white supremacy, then why does it remain in the Capitol? And I wonder if there's even a broader question there about the place of imagery like that and stories like that in our contemporary national discourse.
Right. No, I mean, that's a really great question. Also, why, what is the main story about Indigenous history in the United States about Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims? And, like that's still, I mean, I think it's happening a little bit less, but I think that still becomes like this, it's like rewriting this, 400, 500-year history of genocide into this cozy shared meal. Right. And so like, why do we celebrate Columbus Day instead of Indigenous Peoples Day in the United States? Like, it's very much like the painting is like an indicator of this much broader, I mean, this is why I call it an origin myth of kind of this, which unites Europeans, Christianity, and goodness in the and in America, which cuts out just so much violence that has led to our present moment. And so I think it's so important for us to recognize what that story does. And what that story does is it obscures this history of genocide.
I forgot to unmute. Can you speak a little bit to questions of maybe how these structures or these attitudes have also been present among in the Christianity of Black Americans? So we have a couple of questions here. One of them is, if Christianity is so steeped in whiteness and white supremacy, why is it so much a part of American Black society today? And so I wonder, it's a little bit parallel to the question I asked about these structures within Jewish communities, but I ask it again in this sense because I wonder if it's a chance to speak a little bit to how some of the same overarching models can be reinterpreted or reframed in different contexts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thanks, that's a great question. And it's complicated just because there's so much literature on this. But I mean, what I will say is that there are very different iterations of Christianity in the world and in the United States. So, there's a very old history of like Black Christianity, the Black church, for possibly centuries, the Black church was one of the few spaces that African Americans could gather free from the white gaze, free from white supremacy. And so, there's many different iterations of how the Black church has responded to racism as well. But there's like a long history of it kind of shaping an alternative understanding to challenge white supremacy and white dominance and to affirm Black humanity. And, but I think today there's, different, there's so many different iterations of the Black church as well, in terms of whether it's, sponsoring and like encouraging like anti-racist like politics, or it can also end up focusing on personal salvation as well. So I don't want to say that the Christianity, like qua Christianity, is white supremacist. It's just that there's like a dominant history of Christianity, how Christianity has been interpreted in the United States has been to justify white supremacy, often and to obscure that process. And I think we see that today, unfortunately, as well.
So that brings me to that's a great segue to the question that I was next going to ask, which is about QAnon. Again, if this isn't like squarely in the area of your expertise, that's fair, but I'm passing on the question from a viewer. How do you make sense of the rise of QAnon in this context? So both in terms of religion, white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and specifically in terms of some of the gender and family dynamics that play out within it. For example, with the Save the Children branding and the role of women in the movement. Do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that because I think there is a big overlap between QAnon and white evangelicalism. I mean, I think, for me, like the two like big trends that we have to pay attention to in terms of QAnon are, one, what I was talking about in terms of status threat and kind of the changing demographics in the United States. So Robert P. Jones has a recent book, White Too Long, where he looks at national polling about white Christianity and its relationship to and support for racism, but that he also shows that demographically, white Christians are now a minority in the United States for the first time demographically in hundreds of years, and that because they vote at higher rates than the rest of the population, they have kind of an outsized political influence. But that recognition of that shrinking political power, I think, is driving a lot of movements towards like more radical ends and perspectives. So that's like one of the like kind of broader themes that I think is we can't understand QAnon without that, and kind of the anxiety that produces for people who are used to having an uncontested relationship to national power. Can create a desire to kind of reinforce that power. I mean, the other thing is social media and the way that misinformation and disinformation, propaganda can flourish in ways that were inconceivable even 10 years ago. And I think that QAnon is this big experiment in that. I mean, QAnon comes from 4chan and then 8chan and then 8chan, these websites that were also, sites for the flourishing of white nationalism. Like 8chan was shut down after it inspired too many massacres, like racist massacres by people who were radicalized on the website. And that is where Q was posting, right? But I think, but I think that what that kind of combination of both the kind of status threat and the fear of a changing society and losing of racial power alongside this ability for propaganda and misinformation to spread online kind of creates this really toxic soup of misinformation, so that someone can become convinced by this conspiracy through narratives of children, of wanting to save children, and I think it's fascinating in that QAnon is QAnon supporters are rallying around saving children from supposed pedophiles, when Q himself posts on a website, 8chan, that is run by this American family in the Philippines who moved to the Philippines largely to be able to post pornographic websites that many of them have names that make it sound like they're associated with child pornography. So it feels very suspicious to me that there actually is a deep concern for children, why then would Q be posting from that site? But I do think that, you know, the kind of epistemology of ignorance that I was talking about kind of that has been, I think, fostered by white Christianity in particular, in relation to the broader system of racial inequality, can be kind of like ratcheted up through misinformation and propaganda through social media.
Is there an inherent or an explicit relationship to the idea of chosenness in the Christian white supremacist ideas that you've looked at?
Certainly, yeah. There's, I mean, for white evangelicals, you know, and I think white Christians in general, there's this like understanding of feeling chosen, feeling empowered, you know, attaching it to this like Christian nationalist narrative of where like the United States is exceptional, and you know, like if you're supporting that and part of that, you're also exceptional. And then it also feels like it's a lot to lose if suddenly you're in the minority and you actually have to embrace, like, you know, contend with the fact that you're in a like, you know, like multiracial, multi-religious society. You know, I mean, I remember talking to a white evangelical some time ago who gave he was like complaining about I think it was an airport that they put up a Christmas tree, and then someone complained, and so then they had put up a menorah next to the Christmas tree because like they had to start, you know, they had to like not own privilege like one religion. And this white evangelical man was like, you know, it's kind of like dancing. You need someone to lead and someone to follow. You know, you can't just have have everyone be the leaders. You know, and I do think that that kind of articulates this fear of like, well, if we're not at the center, you know, and we have to be in this like, you know, plurality of religions, then it can feel, you know, like chaos, which I think is, you know, inspires a lot of really negative attitudes, and also is very bad for democracy. You know, because if you are feeling threatened and chaotic and like, you know, feel like your fellow citizens are not, you know, citizens who deserve respect, but are, you know, people who are going to inspire chaos, then it doesn't, you know, it doesn't allow for democracy to flourish.
I see that Steve has reappeared. Do we have time for one more question, or are we wrapping it up?
We are wrapping it up just because we need to end sharply, but I did want to thank Professor Bjork-James so much for this illuminating talk. You know, one of the reasons it was so helpful for the larger series is because you are calling attention to the way in which race and religion intersect with each other, and kind of inform and influence and co-create the other. And that's going to be a major theme going forward in this series. So I really wanted to thank you so much, and thank Anne for her great talk and great questions, I should say. And also to let the audience know about two things upcoming. First of all, our talk next week at the same time, same channel, will be with Professor Mark Dollinger, and it'll be on Black power and Jewish politics. So we'll be thinking over the course of the next few weeks about Blackness as well as about whiteness. And also I just wanted, the Penn Hillel wanted me to let you know, and I'm putting this in the chat right now, that they have organized a program on a related topic on Jews, Zionism, and racial justice, which will be next Tuesday at February 23rd. And if you see the link, you'll see how to register for free. And again, we're really thrilled that people are discussing things with each other, forming discussion groups, and really kind of using this as a launching pad for their own thinking and reading and reflection. And we're indebted to our lecturers for stimulating that. So again, thank you so much, Sophie, and thank you everybody for attending.